Hello, my name is Bruce Gillette. I am the moderator of Presbyterians for Earthcare. We are very grateful for all who have gathered literally across the country for this wonderful webinar that has been planned. I'd like to begin us with a brief prayer, and then Charmel will be introducing our speaker for the evening. Let us pray. Loving God, we give you thanks for all your blessings in our lives. At this hour, many of us have enjoyed an evening meal, and some will soon after this program. We take such meals sometimes too quickly for granted, and all the more we grieve the waste for food not eaten or just simply improperly prepared or for whatever reason wasted. We're thankful for this program tonight that will make us better stewards of what we have been blessed with, and all the more to better care for your creation. We ask your blessing on Mindy and her important work. Be with her and her colleagues. Guide us all by your Holy Spirit, for we pray it in your holy name. Amen. Charmel, would you be so kind as to introduce our evening speaker?
It will be my pleasure. First, I want to tell you a little bit about ReFed, the organization, which you can read about it at refed.org. But basically, it's a nonprofit organization that fights food waste, which is, of course, related to hunger relief. So that's just one area where their interest overlaps with what Presbyterians care about, which is feeding all of the God's people around the earth. ReFed focuses on data-driven solutions to food waste. And in their mission statement, they mention that they are focused on minimizing climate impacts of food systems. So that got my attention because that's certainly an interest of Presbyterians for Earthcare. So when I got to looking around on their website, I found Minnie, and she is ReFed's climate analyst studying the greenhouse gas emission factors used to link food waste to climate change and translating these findings to support ReFed's partners and solution providers, and generally working to improve our understanding of food waste's impacts on the planet. She also supports key data and insights work, including insights engine updates and food business initiatives. She has followed an interest in food systems since college, where she led the Food Action Student Club, working on food waste and nutrition issues, and helped organize the annual Yale Food Systems Symposium in 2015. So that was about 8 years ago, I guess. She holds a master's degree from Bren School of Environmental Science and Management, where her capstone project investigated emissions and carbon sequestration associated with Santa Barbara County's agricultural lands. So welcome to Minnie. We're so glad that she was able to join us tonight, and so happy to see 61 participants who are here with us tonight to learn more about connecting the dots between labels on food, food waste, and greenhouse gas emissions, which impact the planet. So thanks so much, everyone. Take it away, Minnie.
Thank you, Charmel, for that very thorough introduction. And thank you all for being here tonight, and everyone who's going to watch the recording afterwards. I really appreciate your interest in the topic and taking the time to listen to me share a little bit about my passion for the topic, and also a lot about what we do at ReFed to sort of address this important issue. So a little bit more about me. I've always been interested in food recreationally as an eater, but did a little bit of work in college, but really have come to this space in the last 2 years that I've been at ReFed to focus in on specifically the climate impacts of food waste. So I'm ReFed's climate analyst, and I'm the person on the team really who bridges that gap and tries to make that link more explicit so people understand how intimately the two issues are connected. Let's see if I can share my screen. And as I'm going through the presentation, I'm going to try and keep, I have a lot of slides here, but I'm happy to make them available afterwards. And that way we can breeze through them as quickly or as slowly as we want. And you can refer to them afterwards, and feel free to interrupt me with any questions at any point or throw them in the chat and we'll get to them later on in the evening. There we go. So as Sharmell said, ReFed is a national nonprofit dedicated to reducing food loss and waste across the food system. And we do this work through three main pillars. The first is gathering data and generating insights, and that's the team that I sit on. So we're really, we don't do any of the data collection ourselves, but we're sort of pulling sources from researchers and different organizations across the country and pulling them together in a unified methodology to really paint a picture of how much food waste is taking place in the country across different sectors, why it's happening, and what solutions exist and how they might best be applied to the different buckets of food waste that exist. We also have a pretty big part of the team focused on what we call capital innovation and engagement. And so they're really working to bring people together across the system to work on this problem together. And they're the ones that sort of take the data that we've collected and really translate it into findings and insights that are useful for those people so that they can actually take action on this. And again, there's a lot going on here, but we see ourselves as sort of the center of this food waste ecosystem. And we work with anyone from funders to startups who are working to create, for example, organic edible coatings that make avocados last longer, researchers, major grocery retailers, small food recovery organizations, everyone, and we try to bring them all together. So I think what I love about working in this space is that people come to the issue of food waste from many different angles. There are a lot of reasons to care about it. My primary motivation is the climate angle, but it's a broader environmental problem. It's a social problem. As Sharmell said, the issue of food insecurity is really problematic. It's an economic problem because food that isn't getting eaten is, food that money has been spent on, and that's a waste. And it's a problem in terms of sustainable development as we think about how to feed the population of the future. So just to put this all into a global perspective, about a third of all food that's produced across the world goes to waste, and that's about $1 trillion in value and represents 8% of total annual greenhouse gas emissions. If food waste were a country, it would be the third largest emitter in the world after China and the US. And Project Drawdown, I don't know if many of you are familiar, but I'm seeing big thumbs up. They've done some modeling to assess all of the solutions that are currently at scale or need to be scaled up in order to address climate change and stay under either a 1.5 degree warming scenario or a 2 degree warming scenario. And under the 2 degree scenario, food waste comes out as the #1 solution here. And like I said, this is an issue of sustainable development. So the UN predicts that we'll need to increase the global food supply by 50% in order to feed the 2050 population that we expect to have. But we anticipate that with the impacts of climate change, agricultural productivity is actually going to decrease by 21%. So there are these opposing trends where waste is sort of a place where if we, I guess I can to the next slide, if we can reduce the waste, we're making better use of the food that we're already growing, transporting, distributing, and preparing. And so that increase in production needed to feed the future population is lessened a little bit. That pressure goes down. And recognizing that this is an issue of national and international concern, there are multiple groups that have made goals around reducing food waste. So the UN Sustainable Development Goal 12.3 is about reducing food loss and waste by 50% by 2030. And the EPA and the USDA in 2016 made a similar national goal. So I'll dig into the environmental impacts now. So imagine that, a tomato or some other piece of food is sort of moving through the supply chain as it goes from the farm to your plate and maybe off your plate if you don't finish it. And the idea is that that food accumulates embodied emissions as it moves through that value chain, because each step of the process requires different activities that generate emissions and require resources. So things on farm, like, the biggest contributor actually tends to be land use. So if, a natural ecosystem needs to be deforested or otherwise converted to make way for agricultural land, that is a huge source of emissions. But there's also, diesel burn to run tractors, electricity required to pump water, and then things like livestock methane, if you're talking about a dairy product or a meat product. And then as we move through each stage of the supply chain there, you can imagine that there are transportation or refrigeration emissions that might be associated. And then once it leaves the point of generation, which in this diagram, we have it going from a home to a landfill, just as an example, but, waste can be generated at any stage of this chain, and it can end up in any variety of destinations. But the point that we want to call out here is that, thinking of that from farm to the end of life, that full life cycle of emissions, the vast majority of those come from what we call upstream. So before the point where it becomes waste. We talk a lot about landfill methane, and I'll get more into that later. But the truth of the matter is that most of the emissions that you're wasting when you throw out food come from those upstream life cycle stages. And so it emphasizes the importance of preventing food from becoming waste rather than, if it must go to waste, there's a hierarchy of destinations, but it's better to just make sure that the food gets eaten. So here in the US, we just in end of April released new data reflecting 2020 and 2021. So we found that in 2021, 38% of all food produced for consumption in the US went uneaten, and that represented about close to $450 billion. That's 6% of US emissions, so it's a little bit less than the global trend. 22% of all of our freshwater consumption, and represents 16% of our cropland use. And according to the EPA, food is the #1 input into our landfills. And all of this, is especially tragic considering that, there's all this food that's going uneaten, there are all these environmental impacts, and at the same time, we have 1 in 10 Americans who don't have a reliable source of food. So, the flip side of all of this is that addressing food waste can reduce emissions in 3 critical ways. So the first and kind of the most obvious, I think, is this idea of landfill methane. So when food decomposes in an anaerobic environment or an environment without oxygen, there are microorganisms that sort of thrive in those low oxygen environments, and those are the ones that produce methane. And so if we just get food out of the landfill and into a different destination, if it has to be waste, then we're cutting down on a lot of those really potent methane emissions. And the second point is what I was saying earlier about those upstream emissions. So 93% of the emissions associated with wasted food come from those upstream life cycle stages. And so it really emphasizes the importance of targeting the generation of food waste rather than just the management of it afterwards. And then the last point is this idea of beneficial land use. So, what's the point of growing this food and using all this land that could otherwise potentially be reforested or converted to a natural habitat? if the food is not even being eaten. And so 16% of US agricultural land is approximately the size of New York and California combined. And then some other benefits from reducing food waste. If we cut it in half, we would reduce land use by 9%, we would reduce threats to biodiversity by 17%, and we'd reduce water use by 11%. Feels very relevant living here in California. So any questions there before I move on?
How much of the food waste is institutional versus individual families, restaurants, hospitals, colleges, whatever, versus individual homes? You know the breakdown?
Yeah, Bruce, people might think that I tipped you off to ask that question because it's a great segue into the next couple slides.
Okay.
So I'll answer that in one sec, but just so I'm going to dig now into the data that we have about national waste. But before I get into that, I use some different terminology that I just want to make sure everybody's clear on. So, when we talk about food waste in a general term, or wasted food, it's, pretty, people know what you mean when you say food waste. But the more technical term that we like to use is surplus food, because it includes all excess. So anything that doesn't get sold or doesn't get eaten. And that includes all of these different destinations that you see down here at the bottom, including food donations. So although, it's great that the food is ultimately eaten, it's not following that straight path of the sort of originally intended value chain. And so it's additional steps, additional resources that might not be required if it was just going to people to be eaten as intended. So we categorize food going to all of these different destinations as surplus. And then within those, food donation is called rescue. Recycling solutions refer to food that becomes animal feed or is sort of industrially processed into some other product. And then anything that spans from anaerobic digestion, compost, incineration, landfill, and going down the sewer through the incinerator, all of that is considered waste. And if anyone wants to get really technical, this is actually a recent redefinition. Compost and anaerobic digestion used to be considered recycling solutions, and the EPA about a year and a half ago updated their definition to align with international standards there. So there's a lot of federal and local investment going into compost and AD infrastructure. And that's complicated a little bit now by this concept of those now being considered waste destinations. So of the 241 million tons of food that are being produced in the US, as I said earlier, about 38% of it is considered surplus. And so of that, 80 million tons are going to those waste destinations. About 9.5 million tons are being recycled, and just under 2 million tons are being donated. From there, you can see the breakdown across different sectors, as we call them, of the supply chain. So about 17% coming from farms, 15% from manufacturing, 20% combined from retail and food service, and then 48% coming from what we call the residential sector, or from homes. So that's always a pretty striking statistic when we tell people. I think it's sort of hard to imagine that individuals are responsible for so much, but it's sort of, if you think about it, homes are the ultimate destination of food. That's where we assume that most of food gets consumed. So that's sort of where it's intended to end up. And there's just so many people that when you sort of add it up across all the people in the US, it ends up being this really large number. We also consider individuals responsible for some of the waste that takes place in the food service industry, because we found that about 70% of what's wasted in restaurants is plate waste. So what people don't finish on the plates that they're served. And then just, there's lots to pull out here, but one more interesting fact, I think, especially from a donation perspective, is that more than half of farm level waste is still edible, and it just doesn't make it to market for various reasons, or doesn't even get harvested a lot of the time. And then this is just sort of reinforcing what I was saying earlier about there's this hierarchy of destinations. So the idea is that the highest and best use of food is to feed people. And then if it can't feed people, then it should feed animals, with the idea that, people will then eventually eat those animals. And then we get into industrial uses. Composting encompasses things like anaerobic digestion, which also valorizes the nutrients and the carbon present in the wasted food. And then last resort is things like landfill and sewer. And incineration tends to be a little bit controversial. Some states are all about what they call waste to energy. So they're burning the organic matter, but they claim to be controlling any pollution that might be coming from the burning process, and they're oftentimes using the energy from that burning to create what they call bioenergy of some sort. So some people are in favor of that, and some people think that there's not enough control over the pollutants that are being released. So there are a lot of reasons why this food waste occurs, and this list probably doesn't cover all of them, but some major barriers are that the costs and benefits aren't aligned. So especially for businesses, it's in their interest to sell the food, not necessarily to make sure that the customer eats the food, things like that. In this country, compared to other countries, we pay a relatively low cost for both the food itself and to dispose of it. There are countries like Korea and Japan that actually charge a lot of money for the food waste that you produce, which incentivizes people to really cut that down. A lot of disaggregated information. So we deal with that kind of on a daily basis where, one sector isn't measuring at all, another sector is measuring, but in different terms than the next. And so it's pretty hard to have people along the supply chain talking to each other in ways that make sense to one another. Things like competing cultural priorities and expectations. So, people from one background may consider something edible, while as other people don't. My mom is from Taiwan. She grew up in a small farming community, and food was always very scarce for her growing up. So I, learned early on that I wasn't allowed to leave the dinner table if anything was left on my plate. But a lot of people don't come from those backgrounds and don't necessarily have those same priorities. Organizational silos. So again, the people, let's say within a grocery retailer who are working on the floor and clearing inventory that's past its date labels, things like that, aren't necessarily the ones who are in management who are getting the education around how to reduce food waste. So the people who are making decisions are not always the ones who are most intimately connected to why food is not getting eaten. And this is changing now, but historically it's just, businesses and people have a lot of other things to think about. And so food waste has been sort of a low priority item. So, we're working to address this, and the EPA and USDA goal to reduce food waste by 50% has existed since 2016. So we can look at a little bit of data to see how we're doing on this. So there's been a lot of corporate and municipal commitments. There's things like the 10 by 20 by 30, which is a sort of cross supply chain agreement. The EPA runs the 2030 Champions program, where people sort of officially commit to reducing food waste in their own operations. we're very intimately associated with, we're a resource partner for the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment, which is really cool. It's sort of innovative and unprecedented. It's a pre-competitive agreement between jurisdictions in Washington, Oregon, and California, and food businesses in those states to sort of come together and share their data. We, as a resource partner, anonymize and aggregate it, and we're able to come up with a regional estimate of food waste and how that's changing over time because they've agreed to report to us on an annual basis. And then there's the NRDC Food Matters program, where it's probably over 16 cities at this point have joined on, and sort of, their commitment to reduce food waste through consumer education. Individual businesses are committing to reducing food waste, and here are a few of the ones that have been most successful. There's a lot of state policy action because there's been a lack of federal policy action. So individual states have, and I think municipalities as well, have taken it upon themselves to introduce things like organics recycling laws. Like if anyone else is in California, we have SB 1383 that requires jurisdictions to divert a certain % of organic waste from landfills, and has really prioritized compost and AD. We also, there's another component of that is a food donation requirement. There's been a lot more money flowing into the space. But for whatever reason, it's not really having an impact on what we're measuring to be the level of total food surplus across the country. So it was on this sort of upward trend until 2016, and we've leveled it off, but we haven't really made significant progress towards actually reducing it in line with that 2030 goal. And don't pay too much attention to the numbers here, but this is sort of what the state of things. It's similar to a graph I showed earlier, but sort of the breakdown of food that's consumed versus rescued, recycled, and wasted right now. And we have a set of about 42 solutions where we think that if they're implemented at a certain level with a certain level of investment, then we can sort of adjust these buckets and increase the amount of food that's being consumed and rescued and sent to those preferential destinations, and dramatically cut down on what's going to landfill in particular, but also to other waste destinations. All right, so I've been kind of blabbering on for a little while. We like to play a little game to break up the talking. And so, when we're in person, we usually ask people to stand up and then sit down once you get a question wrong, but I'll just have everyone keep track of your answers on your own, and then let me know in the chat at the end what your score was. All right, so who knows how many days past the sell-by date can you eat eggs? Is it none, that's gross, 3 to 5 days, 10 to 20 days, or 20 to 35 days? It is 10 to 20 days. And I usually go by the trick of, or actually, I think that's the next question, so I won't give it away. Okay, so there's a trick where if you put the egg in a bowl of water or a glass of water, is it good to eat if it floats or if it sinks? This one is sinks. So the idea is that if it's floating, that means that sort of the shell has become compromised enough that some air has gotten in to make it float. Let's say it floated, so you throw it out. How long of a shower could you have taken with the water to produce that egg? Is it a 5-minute shower, an 11-minute shower, 25 minutes, or 40 minutes? This one's 11 minutes. And then instead of an egg, what if you threw out a hamburger? How many minutes of showering would that equate to? 20 minutes, 50 minutes, 75, or an hour and a half?
Gee.
Bruce got it. All right, so let's say that we threw out all of the leftover turkey from Thanksgiving. How many car trips between New York and San Francisco would produce the same amount of GHG emissions? 8,000, 80,000, 800,000, or 8 million? That one is 800,000. Let's talk about portions. In the last 40 years, obesity prevalence among children and the calories in a chicken Caesar salad have almost doubled, tripled, quadrupled, or stayed the same. It's doubled. What about the calories in the average cookie? Have they doubled, tripled, quadrupled, or stayed the same? And I said the answer for this one earlier, so hopefully everyone gets this. Which of the following is responsible for most wasted food? Is it farms, grocery stores, restaurants, or households? Households. And the last question is, all right, let's say we're all very worried about this food waste issue. What can you do about it? All right. Thanks for playing along. Let me know in the chat how many of those you got right, if you'd like. When I first took that quiz, I thought I was going to get fired because I didn't know any of them. And it's still, you know, the big numbers are hard to keep track of, but a fun reminder of the scale of the problem. So I'll get into now ways that we can work to reduce food loss and waste. So what we did a couple of years ago is come up with a sort of, you know, bucket the action that we thought needed to happen into 7 key action areas. And they fall into those 3 categories of preventing food from becoming waste in the first place. And you see we have a lot of options here, and then rescue the food or recycle anything that remains. And these sort of somewhat mirror the different sectors, these 5 prevention categories, but they in general are activities that any kind of business could undertake. So I just, how are we doing on time? I might move through these pretty quickly and try to focus on the consumer side of things. But basically, the next few slides will be for each sector. So farm, manufacturing, retail, food service, and consumer. Yeah.
Maybe about 10 more minutes and then we'll have questions and answers.
Yeah, great. So for each of those, I've just pulled the top 3 causes, and this is data from our website that you can find, and then the sort of top solutions in terms of tons diverted. We also have all of our solutions listed by the cost of implementing them, by the GHG emissions that you could avoid by implementing such a solution, the water that you could save by doing that. And so, you know, there are different metrics depending on what someone cares about the most. But so, like I said, for farm level waste, a lot of it is just left behind for, you know, it's damaged by weather and it's no longer edible, or it's been attacked by pests. But also there's a significant amount that just, you know, doesn't meet the specifications. It's not beautiful enough red pepper, or it's a slightly wonky shaped carrot or something like that. For manufacturers, it's mostly production line waste. And so a top solution there is sort of making sure that the production lines are working optimally and sort of working most efficiently, or what this is sort of like an up and coming food product area, but this idea of upcycling, so taking things that are normally just, you know, the trimmings from making baby carrots and turning it into a juice instead, or something like that. For retailers, a big one is date label concerns. Over half of retail waste is tossed because retailers aren't comfortable selling the food to people for whatever reason. And a lot of the time it isn't necessarily actually a safety concern. Like I said earlier, close to 70% of food service waste is plate waste. So a big way to address that is just cutting down on portion size that people get served. And then for consumers, you know, a lot of food that we toss out in the home is what we consider probably truly an inedible part, no matter what your cultural background is. You know, there's some, you know, some people eat the apple core or whatever, but for the most part, you know, no one's eating their corn husks or, you know, the shells of your peanut or something like that. But a lot of it spoils, and you know, that's something that could be handled through knowing more about when to refrigerate or when to freeze or how much to buy, and then just changing people's opinions about whether or not they want to eat their leftovers, or cooking so that you're not creating leftovers. So, you know, there's a lot of tips out there around how to cut down on consumer waste, but we like to point to the Food Waste 5, and it sort of goes in order of the steps that you take when you're buying food. So in the first place, you know, think about planning your meals before you go to the grocery store. Think about what you already have and what you actually need to buy. Look up how to store food properly. If you find that you keep throwing out the same things because they're going bad, you might be, you know, storing fruits with vegetables in the same drawer, and they're giving off gases that make each other ripen faster. Learn more about what those date labels mean. So a lot of people misinterpret them, and I'll get more into that in a little bit. One thing I've learned a lot since joining ReFed is that you can freeze just about anything. You know, it may not keep the same texture. So, you know, don't expect to be able to like eat sliced cheese that you've frozen necessarily, but you know, I pretty much freeze milk, spinach, things that tend to go bad faster. And then I like to play a little game with myself, which is sort of like one day a week or something. You know, normally I might be like, okay, I guess I need to go to the grocery store now, but one day a week I'll say, okay, here's a day where I challenge myself to make a meal out of whatever scraps I have left in the fridge. So just pushing yourself to be creative and make the most of what you already have in the house before you go out for another trip to the grocery store. So I wanted to focus in before we wrap up on some of the topics that it seemed like you all were most interested in. So date labels, not many people know this, but there's no federal standard for what those words, which words get used and what they mean. And so, you know, as we saw, it's a leading cause of consumer waste, considering that what gets thrown out at the retail level is sometimes lumped into that. And so we work pretty closely with an organization called the Zero Food Waste Coalition. They've only recently come into formal existence, but it's ReFed, the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic, NRDC, and World Wildlife Fund. And so we've all had programs around this for many years. And this is sort of how we, in a limited capacity, push for some policy change. So every year there is a bipartisan food date labeling act that gets introduced to Congress, and it hasn't gone through yet, but we still keep pushing it forward. And it's using this language that seems to have coalesced as sort of the best standard practice, which is that best if used by should be to indicate a food's quality. And so, maybe the manufacturer can't guarantee that your yogurt will be quite as creamy as they advertise if it's past that date, but it has nothing to do with the safety and whether or not that yogurt is still good to eat. And then use by is a very simple, limited term that refers only to the food safety. And part of that bill is also asking the FDA and USDA to educate people about what those different date labels mean. A lot of the time what you see on the package is actually communication either within the grocery store so they know when they need to take something off the shelf and toss it, which is not usually a safety thing, it's usually a quality thing, or it's communicating from the manufacturer to the retailer about those quality issues. I also wanted to dive in a little bit on donating food. So as I mentioned earlier, only 2% of all food surplus gets donated, and everything that's remaining represents about 149 billion meals worth of food. And so obviously it's not quite as simple as, all this food just needs to be distributed properly, but it's still a significant amount of food that exists in the system that could be eaten by somebody if there was a little bit of better management. So of that surplus, 22% is those inedible parts I was mentioning, like bones and peels. And an additional 33% is considered not fit for human consumption because it's spoiled, moldy, got ruined because you forgot to wash the pot, something like that. But if we were all a little bit better about managing our food, maybe that could be edible. And so even setting that bucket aside, that's 45% of those 149 billion meals that are still edible. And it seems worth investigating whether or not those could be rescued and fed to the people who are hungry. A lot of people don't know this either, that, people are worried about liability of donating food that's past those dates that are on packaging. But the Good Samaritan Act, which, was passed years and years ago, actually provides some protection to people who donate that food in good faith, as long as they take certain precautions. So we don't give specific legal advice, but there are some resources that I've listed at the bottom that might help you figure out whether or not you'd be protected in your food pantries and food banks. A little more on landfill methane. So like I said earlier, methane is the greenhouse gas that's produced when food, but also, like grass clippings and other organic matter ends up in an anaerobic environment. And that's what happens in a landfill is sort of, layers and layers of waste get compressed on top of one another and there's no oxygen to get in there. And so the bacteria that thrive in those environments are the ones that produce methane. So it's 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide on a 20-year time scale. I think you may see other numbers, it's a little bit more standard to talk about greenhouse gases on a 100-year time scale. And in that scenario, it's about 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And that's because methane has this short, what they call a residence time in the atmosphere. So it gets released and because of its chemical properties, it breaks down much faster than carbon dioxide after about 12 years of bouncing around and bumping into other molecules and reacting. And so this becomes really important, and it's why methane has been talked about so much in the last few years, is that we're all working towards these 2050 goals to limit warming. And because methane breaks down so quickly, if we can reduce concentrations that are being emitted right now, then we'll see the effects of that reduction before 2050. Whereas reductions in carbon dioxide are important, but we won't see the reduction, they'll still exist in the atmosphere for another 100 or so years. So that's why there's a lot of emphasis on landfill methane right now, and some preliminary EPA research where they're scheduled to come out, I think, any week now, a new report on landfill methane, but preliminary research indicates that if we diverted food waste fully from landfills, it would reduce the methane generation by 33%. And then the last thing, I know some people were interested in composting, so I just wanted to emphasize that there are a lot of different ways to compost, and I think what's most appropriate for a person or a community really depends on the local context. So in the event that you live somewhere that doesn't have a centralized system, or it's not practical to do any kind of outdoor composting, there are increasingly these countertop composters that, it's not quite like creating soil per se, but it is dehydrating and breaking down those food scraps that you may have. And could be an option if you, say, live in an apartment building or don't have a lot of access to outdoor space. But I also, I'm a big composter, and it's pretty easy, I think, to get started if you have a little backyard corner and just want to, it may not always go perfectly, but it's an inexact science, and it's sort of fun to play around with. The ratios of food to what they call browns, or things that are more high, carbon content than nitrogen, to get the right mix. There are some cool community composting projects that we've been learning about recently. We just had our annual food waste summit in St. Louis in May, and we visited, community composting can be someone who just collects all the food waste from their block, or it could be someone who collects, a community garden that's collecting from neighborhoods all over a city. It can really vary in scale. But what's great is that there's a whole spectrum of technology that can be applied, and it can be very low cost. It's high labor intensive usually. But I think that flexibility makes it more accessible. And then just the largest version of this is a centralized composting facility. And I have composting in quotes here because I think most people know what composting is over anaerobic digestion, but a lot of these facilities tend to actually digest the material in these sort of closed chambers to break it down faster. And then what's left after the digestion process gets composted, and often the material at the end is called compost regardless. And I'll just do a little plug here we have a tool on our website called the Policy Finder, and it highlights states and cities or counties that have laws in place that might make it more conducive for them to set up sort of centralized infrastructure. So yeah, one last little plug. I'll actually just click here so you can see what it looks like. So we have 6 different tools. The food waste monitor, that is to, you might recognize all the data around what type of food is being wasted in each sector, what are the different causes and where they end up is in here. The solutions database, where we have all of these different solutions listed out, and we have fact sheets on each of them so you can learn a little bit more about what that means. A solution provider director, where we list out organizations that are actually working to reduce food waste in various capacities. An impact calculator, where you can enter the amount of food waste that you're generating and find out the greenhouse gas, water, and meals impact. And then we have 2 newer tools, a capital tracker that shows how much investment is going into this space from both private and public sources. And then lastly, this policy finder, where you can look at different types of laws that have been implemented across the country. And I think that's it. Do we have a little bit of time for Q&A?
Definitely. If you raise your hand using the reaction, it'll put you up to the top of the screen. It's a little hard for us to monitor when we have 62 people on the screen. But if you go down to the bottom of the Zoom, there is reactions, and you click raise your hand, it'll take you up to the top and we'll easily see if you have a question. I did put in the chat the link to the webinar we did at our last conference on composting, and there's PowerPoints and other resources there. This is excellent, Minnie. I think you overwhelmed them and they can't think of anything to ask, which I'm really
I
surprised.
do see, I think Lynn has her hand up.
Okay, well, I don't see Lynn, but Lynn, go ahead and share your question.
Yeah, this is what I had with the chat also. If you put food waste in a garbage disposal in your kitchen, like, is that bad for the water system, or could you say something about that? Because I didn't grow up with those things, but I don't really know what to do with garbage disposals.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with the, you know, the workings of the treatment plants. I don't think there's anything harmful to the water system, but there's more and more research indicating that the food is breaking down in the pipes as it's getting to that treatment plant, in a way that we actually think that there's more methane being released than previously thought. So in our hierarchy of destination, you know, it's like very tempting, I think, to just shove stuff down the drain and, you know, grind it up. But our hierarchy reflects that we think it's kind of on par with landfill, honestly.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Charmel?
Yeah, thanks. I saw several comments and questions in the chat about how food pantries at churches and other places in the community will not accept food if it's, you know, past the sell-by date or past the best-by date or something. So it seems like we need some kind of education among our food pantries in our churches. And I'm wondering if there is a book out there that anybody has written that Sunday school classes could study. And if not, is there any kind of a resource, you know, that like a church could put together, like a 3-week study on, you know, why is it that we're wasting so much food from our church kitchens or from our homes, and how can we do better? And what is this business about the labels on the food cans, and how can we educate our food pantries that it's okay to take it? It just seems like that as a community of faith, we could do a better job of educating ourselves and educating others around us, but where do we start?
Yeah, so those are all great questions. I don't think that I haven't come across any, you know, books or resources specifically for groups of faith, but I do know, you know, there are a few resources on the internet, usually like one leader in an industry will sort of write a guide. So I have in my slides linked Sodexo just came out with a food donation guide. So it's more for food service providers, but I think could be interesting if you are interested in accepting material from food service operations and as, you know, sort of general best practices. And then the other point you made, I think, about measuring your own waste internally, you know, we always say you can't change what you don't know. And so measuring, you know, doing an audit of some sort, you know, it doesn't really matter how long it is, you know, sort of the more representative it is of your average operations, the better. But I think, you know, getting started is always the hardest part. So just getting the will and the buy-in from everyone to do it in the first place is a great start.
We do have a good YouTube in the form of this evening's program will be on YouTube, and we'll also have the PowerPoint on the PEC website. And any other links you want to give us, we will include that in this section for this presentation. So that'll get a church group started along the way as well. We have a couple of other people in the chat. I think I saw, no, they all disappeared. Okay. Other questions or comments?
Mark has his hand up.
Okay, Mark.
Click. Oh, am I unmuted?
Yes.
All right, this is June. And I guess my question was related to the last one, and that is, is there a like a central resource, a place we can look at that will explain those food labels to people so that we can help people understand that Best By does not mean it's no longer edible?
So I don't think that there is, and that's because there isn't standardization. So, almost every manufacturer and every retailer will have their own system for what those different things mean. But I think I'll double check if what the source that I have linked on that slide talks about the most common ones. And if it doesn't, I'll make sure to include that before I send it over to you all.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, because I'm curious, I understand if it says Best By or and the sell by also it's kind of like eggs, they have a sell by date, but they're really good after that.
Yeah.
I knew that,
But this Food Labeling Act that you said gets introduced every year but never goes anywhere, it would address that, right? It would set up some standardization so that people would better understand. This is called the Food Labeling Act, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it advocates for just having two different labels, one that's just about quality and one that's just about safety. So hopefully that cuts down on the confusion. And
okay. Well, thank you.
yeah, I mean, I don't know how much I can say this is our formal position, because there are some safety concerns, but most of the time, if you sort of understand how a food breaks down and you use your senses, I think once you know what to look for, you can say, this smells right to me, or this doesn't smell right to me, or, little tiny taste. And if it doesn't taste right, then feel free to toss it.
Mm-hmm.
So Betty's put in the chat the FDA understanding expiration dates. And then what we expect is for your organization to have an amendment to these saying, yes, but to paragraph 4 or whatever. But that's at least something there.
Bruce, there's another hand up. Sarah's had her hand up.
I am sorry, I'm not seeing the hand.
My hand down.
Yeah. Sarah, go ahead.
I put my question in the chat, so you can ignore my question in the chat. And when you showed us the chart that said the EPA had moved composting out of the category of recycling, it seemed like there was more to say about that. I didn't really understand. It sounded like it was saying composting wasn't as good as we thought or something. I just wondered.
Yeah, so I think for a while people were in agreement. I think people still are in agreement that sort of landfill is the worst of the worst. And so a lot of goals were made around, okay, let's just do everything in our power to get food out of the landfill. And everything else, every other destination is considered a solution that counts towards that 50% reduction. But I think with this understanding that we're gaining that most of the emissions, most of the resources are required in those upstream stages, and sort of because of that, the importance of just preventing food from becoming waste at all, like the difference between sending food to landfill and sending it to compost is like maybe this much, but if you just didn't waste the food at all, you'd save this much. And so understanding that trade-off, I think we're shifting towards prioritizing those prevention solutions. And so there's still, there will always be food that does spoil for whatever reason, is considered inedible. There's that little bit of unavoidable waste. And we think that composting and digestion are the best solutions there, because at least then you're sort of holding on to the nutrients, holding on to the carbon content. You're not generating methane.
Yeah, it kind of
a little bit of gases that are released, but nothing on the scale of a landfill. And so in that case, that's the preferred pathway.
It's kind of related to the discussion earlier when they were talking about garbage disposal things. It sounds like what you're saying is if you have, like carrot peelings or, stems of things that aren't edible, it's better to compost them than to send them into the garbage disposal.
I think so.
From
yeah.
what you said. Okay.
This is
Thank you.
Jerry. I have my hand up.
Yeah.
My wife works at our church's food pantry, and she says that a regional food distributor requires that our food pantry adhere to the sell-by dates, or we won't get food. And I think the same with a grocery store that donates food to the food pantry. Otherwise, you're off the list.
Yeah, I think that's why we emphasize education so much, is the more that people understand, I think people are very concerned about liability, and understandably so. You don't want to harm anyone by giving them food that has gone bad. And, these organizations are often nonprofits or working on really tight budgets, like they can't afford to deal with a lawsuit, or, that's just not the mission. But I think the more that there is an understanding that, there is no federal standard for these labels, they don't mean what you think they mean, and that there should be room for more flexibility in accepting that food. It feels like there's a lot of change that could happen if we just shift everybody's understanding.
How widespread are these liability protections? Are they becoming more so?
Right now, I think the protections have been in place since 1996, those ones that fall under. I don't think that it explicitly lists out churches or food pantries, but they do list schools and food banks, and there are several other categories. And so that has been in place since 96, and it's just having people recognize that that is a national law. And I guess a lawsuit could still be brought, and then it just wouldn't, it wouldn't go anywhere. But I think even just the threat of that can turn some people off.
We got lots of lawyers in the Presbyterian Church. We'll take care of you. Other questions or comments? We have had a practice, Mindy, of stopping the program after an hour and not finishing things, but there are some people who don't want to be recorded and put on YouTube. And this gives them the freedom to be able to ask questions without becoming YouTube celebrities. So at this point,